This is an unusual conference in many ways. It's unusual to have a homeschooling conference that isn't packed with vendors trying to sell you all types of curriculum. Instead, we have limited the number of vendors and sought only those who offer a range of services and materials that we feel support and encourage unschooling. Please patronize these vendors. They're located in ports, and they're open until 6 p.m. tonight, and then again from 8 to 12 tomorrow. Note, too, that speakers and authors who have books to sell have their own area, which is right out here in the Wellington room, and that's the first room outside the ballroom. If during the weekend you want to find a particular speaker or author and speak with them directly, that would be the first place to chat, would be the speaker's room. We've made all sorts of arrangements to make children welcome at this conference. All we ask of parents is to please encourage your children to be sensitive to others' enjoyment of this conference. Now, our first keynote this weekend is by Micki and David Colfax. Many people know them as the Harvard Goat Boys parents, but that event is really just a small part of their very busy lives. I can't tell you everything that keeps them busy, since that's David and Micki's business. But you can ask them yourselves. However, there are two aspects about their lives that not too many people remark on and that they're public about. One is that David has been a member of his local school board for 15 years. The other is that David also does a radio program about education issues, not just homeschooling issues. So like many of us at this conference, their concern about education extends to all children, not just homeschoolers. Micki and David became friends of mine over the past few years as we kept bumping into each other at various conferences throughout America. Indeed, I can claim that I have bored Micki and David throughout America with my speeches. But what most impresses me about Micki and David and their boys is that they're so honest and direct with their observations. They're not afraid to say when their choices have been less than ideal for them, and they readily acknowledge their mistakes. The Colfaxes have spent the better part of the past 12 years telling people about the ways that they help their children learn to grow into responsible, happy adults. And you can read about that in their books, Hard Times in Paradise, and particularly in Hard Times in Paradise, and in Homeschooling for Excellence. What we've asked Micki and David to speak about today is how they help their children learn through the incidents of their daily lives, not through some master fixed curriculum created by distant authorities. John Holt wrote, "A life worth living and work worth doing. That is what I want for children and all people, not just or not even something called a better education." I present to you Micki and David Colfax, who tell us just how they help their children get lives worth living and find work worth doing.
Good morning. We're delighted to be here. When Pat Ferrega asked us if we would give the keynote at the historic celebration of 20 years of growing without schooling, we said we'd be honored to do so. And when he asked if we could talk about homeschooling and work without a whole lot of thought, we said yes. After all, wasn't one of the dominant themes in both of our books, Homeschooling for Excellence and Hard Times in Paradise, about all the work did on our Shiny Moon Ranch over more than 20 years? Books in Berkeley some years ago, and we didn't quite know what to make of our being introduced as the hardest working family in California, which certainly was an exaggeration. Even so, we had to admit that work, intentionally or not, in all of its manifestations and permutations, was central to our effort to put together a homestead, and not so incidentally, provide the boys with an education that would enable them to survive in an increasingly complex and even hostile world. But as we gave Pat's request more thought, we found ourselves wondering why exactly we, or indeed anyone else, should be leading off what promises to be a powerful and compelling celebration of John Holt's legacy and growing without schooling, with a discussion of work? I think the answer can be found if we can recall for a moment or two our concerns as public school refuseniks 20 or 25 years ago. Most of us were functioning in something of a social and intellectual vacuum, and as such had to deal with the very large and yet unanswered question of whether we could really obtain and secure the freedom we so desperately sought to educate our children at home. Could we really get away with it? Some of us were up in the hills, oblivious to the fact that there were others in towns, cities, and suburbs who surreptitiously, and too often fearfully, were cobbling out ways of teaching our children at home and out of the legal, political, and bureaucratic reach of the public school establishment. Over those early years, we had to deal with wide-ranging, if generally uncoordinated efforts from various quarters to squelch the nascent homeschooling movement. But over the last 20 years, in the time since Growing Without Schooling was founded, we seemed to have prevailed. Homeschooling, while not as free of bureaucratic restraints and legal obstacles as some of us feel it should be, is legal in all states, is no longer regarded as something of an unnatural act engaged in by hippies, survivalists, and assorted professional malcontents. Today's school administrators, marketers, mainstream media, computer companies are interested in homeschooling, if only to see if they can find a way to turn a profit on it. Seymour Papert, the inventor of Logo and a member of the MIT Media Lab, having hit the bureaucratic wall in his efforts to get his ideas accepted in public schools, offers homeschooling as a way of implementing his program in his newly published book, The Connected Family. And we were recently informed that 2 weeks from now, a delegation of administrators from the county school district David has represented for over a dozen years will attend the annual California Homeschooling Conference in Sacramento in order to learn how they might put together a cutting-edge independent study program. And Susan Shepherd, I understand, is now writing a homeschooling column for the Microsoft in-house newsletter. Clearly, as I am sure Nancy Flint will be describing in considerably more detail in her session, the theory and practice of homeschooling is changing the way Americans think about education and the family. However odd, subversive, and revolutionary it may have been regarded by some, homeschooling has become, as one homeschooling advocate predicted just 10 years ago, mainstream. And as a result, many parents who a decade or two ago wouldn't have had the slightest idea of what homeschooling was all about, much less consider it as a serious educational option, are among its most enthusiastic advocates. It would be wrong to assume that what we may someday call our heroic period, the years of crisis and confrontation, is all behind us, now that homeschooling has become better understood and more widely accepted. Indeed, we would suggest that as homeschooling and its variants more and more affect the institutions of our increasingly repressive and controlling society, our opponents, the teachers' unions, administrators, politicians, and all of those who make big money by supplying the educational fraternity with artifacts ranging from dumbed-down textbooks to costly facilities, will become more sophisticated in their efforts to co-opt, contain, and ultimately control the homeschooling movement. But in the face of obvious and irrefutable evidence that American schools are becoming less and less concerned with education and more obsessed with control, 2 weeks ago, the Los Angeles School Board directed all schools to conduct drop and cover drills at least once a semester in an effort to prepare pupils to protect themselves from outbreaks of neighborhood gunfire. Homeschoolers clearly have the competitive edge in virtually any confrontation with the forces of reaction down the line. Having succeeded in so many ways in establishing the legitimacy of homeschooling over the last 2 decades or so, and having established our right to teach and learn what we want, where we want, when we want, and how we want, we have opened up new realms of freedom and are faced with the task of using that freedom to our best advantage. How do we do this? For those among us who believe that their job is to implement a divinely, politically, or economically inspired educational ideology, that may not be so much of a concern. It doesn't take much imagination or effort to replace the authoritarians and rigidities of state-controlled education with the authoritarians and rigidities of other realms. But for those of us who are wary of prepackaged systems of thought, of turnkey ideologies, those of us who properly question authority and recognize that many of our institutions function primarily to control our lives and stifle the spirit, our recently gained freedom can be problematic and even intimidating, as psychiatrist Erich Fromm observed many years ago. The words of the celebrated social critic Janis Joplin to the contrary, freedom is rather more than nothing left to lose. When we are talking here about the freedom to educate our children, there is indeed a whole world to lose. In Sigmund Freud's famous phrase, all that matters is love and work. We can take as a given that most parents, and most homeschooling parents especially, love their children and manifest it in all the usual ways. Philip Levine, in one of his poems entitled What Work Is, conflates Freud and says that real work is not what we conventionally think of it as being, activities that take place in factory, field, or office. Real work, he suggests, is being able to express familial love. So in this poetic sense, when we talk about work, we are in a way addressing, however obliquely, the hopes, fears, aspirations, and love we as parents invest in our children. But work, as conventionally viewed, has gotten a bad rap, historically and philosophically, and for good reason. From antiquity, when Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, living in a slave-based society which enabled them to issue lofty pronouncements on such matters, work could be divided into 2 categories. That which was done by slaves, and that done by those, to put it into contemporary enlightened terms, who lived off slave labor. In Book 6 of his Ethics, Aristotle asserts that practical experience was not only base, servile, and menial, but that it was the opposite of intelligence. For intelligence is derived not from experience, but from definitions which cannot be proved. Even John Dewey, in his 1915 classic Democracy in Education, has a hard time trying to explain how this view dominated not generations, but centuries of Western thought. Ironically, it was the conservative philosopher Karl Popper who finally and scathingly dissected the arrogance of antiquity, motivated in part, perhaps, because Sir Karl was apprenticed in his youth to a cabinet maker and turned to philosophy, he says in his biography, when he discovered that it was easier to become a philosopher than to acquire the skills to become a cabinet maker. Parenthetically, we might note that Popper, his eminence notwithstanding, was not beloved by other professional philosophers. But it was not only the ancients, or the philosophers who demeaned work. Today we tend to romanticize rural work and the bucolic splendor of agrarian life. But consider Markham's famous poem, Man with a Hoe, inspired by Millet's painting, in which the field worker is described as stolid and stunned, a brother of the ox. Or the great advocate of a new American nation, steadied by the values of small farmers, Thomas Jefferson. Deeply in debt and returning home in 1797 after a stint as America's first Secretary of State, he established an industrial nailery at Monticello, which he described in a letter saying, "I now employ a dozen little boys from 10 to 16 years of age, overlooking all the details of their business myself, and drawing from it a profit on which I can get along until I can put my farms into a course of yielding profit." The little boys, of course, were some of the 200 slaves who supported the man who wrote the most famous statement of equality in American history. There is some evidence, as Philippe Aries points out in his 1962 study, Centuries of Childhood, that historically, work did not have the existential value which we have given it for something like 100 years. One was defined, and defined oneself, more in terms of when and where and to whom one was born, rather than what one did. Communities were bound together by festivities and games, Aries argues, to an extent that is hard for us to imagine. One might live by the sweat of one's brow. Life might be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But work was merely one element in the organic totality of life, however impoverished, narrow, or hard. In the West, in Europe and America, it was not until late in the Industrial Revolution that one's work, what one did for a living, became existentially important. We can see this in the literature of the period, and that is why the genius of Charles Dickens and his continuing appeal to us today is in no small part attributable to the skill with which he documented these changes in a time not so long ago. All of this may be very true, you may be thinking, but what does it have to do with homeschooling? Ted Wade, in his 6th edition of the Homeschool Manual, relates what he calls the Colfax story, and identifies the 5 characteristics of our, and I quote, providing rather than pushing program. These include 1, expecting achievement and providing an atmosphere for the joy of its accomplishment. 2, encouraging independence and critical thinking. 3, using materials and methods that concentrate more on the end result of the learning than on the drill and busy work. 4, waiting for readiness. So far, fair enough. But when Mr. Wade credits us with creating, quote, a challenging physical work program which provides both the diversion to make book learning a refreshing change of focus and the physical exercise to keep the brain alert, unquote, he loses us. Is that what we were doing? If that's the impression we conveyed in either of our books, then we need to clarify a few things. Perhaps in our efforts to make homeschooling as palatable as possible to our readers, we devoted too much attention to describing the 2x4s and nails, so to speak, without paying enough attention to the structure we were building. One can neither construct nor describe a whole by iterating its components. Perhaps that is why Mr. Wade's kind efforts to explain how, quote, a challenging physical work program, unquote, fit into our homeschooling program falls so short. We were not seeking diversions, refreshing changes of focus, or trying to keep brains alert with a challenging physical work program. Conceivably, all that might very well happen if homeschoolers seeking those ends were to impose a challenging physical work program on their children. But this would be missing the point entirely. Work, we would argue, should not be seen as a component, a part of what we do as homeschoolers or non-schoolers, or indeed as families, but rather as an intrinsic, inseparable part of the effort to construct our realities as parents and families. Work, we would argue, should not be construed as a means to, but an end in and of itself, as we and our children shape and are shaped by the world. To comprehend what this means, maybe we need to suspend interest here, if only for a few minutes, in the mechanics of how and what and why we do what we do as homeschoolers. Perhaps as such, our visions are inadequate to the task. I think it's interesting that John Holt, after spending so many years trying to make sense of public education, eventually realized that the totality of what we called education was the problem, and as such, was beyond repair. Paulo Freire, whose Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which celebrated its 20th anniversary last year, and which has had a massive impact in the way we think, not only about education, but the political world in which it exists, did not draw upon Dewey or call upon Ted Sizer to help formulate his views. Has anyone else had the sheer audacity to publish to wide acclaim in the United States during the Cold War a book on education that cites Marx, Engels, Hegel, Lenin, Mao, Che Guevara, Fanon, and Lukács almost exclusively? You just might want to ask John Gatto about this in his session called The Guerrilla Curriculum. At the heart of Freire's book is a very simple and straightforward thesis that conventional education is an instrument for the maintenance of a culture of silence and denies that the world is, quote, a problem to be worked on and solved, not static and given. People are creators of culture, and all their work can be creative. I work, and working, I transform the world. Education and work do not consist of banking the 1,000 or 10,000 things reactionaries like Professor Edward Hirsch believe every appropriately docile American needs to know, or being manipulated by elites, but is a struggle to create reality or real consciousness. Even though he does not, and perhaps cannot, acknowledge it, the eminent learning theorist and mainstream educational guru, Jerome Bruner, has been influenced over the last 20 years by constructionists like Freire and, of course, Ivan Illich. Reality is made, not found, he acknowledges in his latest book, The Culture of Education. And yes, he admits, perhaps he paid too much attention to how people learn rather than why people learn in his long and illustrious career. But of all those who have shaped our thinking about our work and education over the last 2 or 3 decades, of those who have made their mark and had second thoughts, None has done so as dramatically as Illich, author of Deschooling Society. "Ah, that book was naive," he declares in a collection of essays put together by Matt Hearn last year. "Why," he asks, "do so many people, even ardent critics of schooling, become addicted to education as to a drug? Stop reifying education," he demands. "All of our education beliefs, arrangements, and rituals reflect, reinforce, and actually create belief in the values of learning pursued under conditions of scarcity. Lifelong learning, in-service training, how to play games, these are nothing but cliches and tricks that have, quote, thoroughly polluted societies, not just schools, with the stench of education." When we talk about work and education, we find ourselves constrained by scarcity, economical, social, intellectual, spiritual. "We need to take control of our lives," says Illich, with the result that, quote, "we do not need to make special arrangements for learning," unquote. Is this an extreme or radical view, abstract, impractical, and unworkable? Aaron Falwell, writing in the same volume edited by Hearn, tells about how John Holt handled questions about his views on education. Holt would refuse to define education and answer that he learned while living, working, playing, and being with friends. His point was that education is generally construed as a treatment, a laying on of information, culture, technique, icons. In this sense, Holt predated Illich. We do not have to make special arrangements for learning. If we understand, then, that we as parents are responsible for more than the mere education of our children, that we are the principal agents involved in their efforts to construct their realities, whose task it is to enable them to apprehend the world as, in Frere's words, a problem to be worked on and solved, only then do our attempts at analysis, a review of tactics and strategies, will enable our children to deal effectively with the world make sense. And having established at least something of a context in which we can talk about activities that we might want to call work, let's take a look at some of its faces, at least as they appeared to us over the years. First, let's consider work as a pastime. One of the reasons we suspect that many unschooling parents are interested in helping their children to find useful, meaningful, or challenging work is that as unschoolers, we have discovered that our children, freed from school, have been granted a gift of time. Some will revel in this freedom, while others, particularly those who have attended schools and have been socialized into a way of thinking in which others make the rules, set the agenda, and control the timing, will not. It is not a problem only of young people. In our town, we know several well-educated, highly intelligent people of what we used to be called of independent means, who spend their days pouring samples for tourists in our boutique wineries. We've known professional people, retirees, who have taken jobs as clothing store clerks or gasoline station attendants out of sheer boredom. It's not the money, they'll tell you. It's a way of passing time. Reed, our third son, now a civil rights attorney and the father of our first grandchild, being the youngest for the first couple of years on the mountain, had considerably more time than the older two, which he put to use, spending many an afternoon in a corner of the house practicing the games he'd try to talk us into playing after dinner. And there was no doubt that from his perspective, this was work. Many times we'd come in from working on a project he couldn't help on and find him on the floor, brow furrowed, playing against imaginary opponents whose pieces he would so helpfully move around the board for them. Needless to say, he became a consummate game player. Was this really work? There's no question that he was serious about it, and that it occupied his afternoons for a few months. Was it a good or creative use of his time? Who can say? Was it better than watching television or playing Nintendo games? Perhaps. Does it make any sense to seek work for our children in order to fill up their days? We don't think so. Reed, of course, was engaged in something we might call work as play, play as work. Young children play soldiers, cowboys and Indians, play house and doctor, play dolls, and engaging in the culture of childhood are rehearsing the adult culture. Is this play or is it work? Does it matter? At a recent computer conference, we found ourselves on the edge of what became a heated discussion of what children are doing today that they didn't do before the age of computers. The split came along gender lines. The men talked about how they used to take things apart, clocks, radios, and so forth, and acquired an understanding of how things work that is largely denied kids today. How much can you learn by tearing apart a transistorized calculator or clock? The women at the conference, all high-level computer specialists, disagreed with their male colleagues. They hadn't taken many things apart as children, and here they were, computer experts, many of whom outranked the males. We play house, one of them said, and several others agreed. Ah, that at our house, my 4-year-old plays computer, said one woman. Her daughter, Sarah, often invites her friends over, takes the pillows off the furniture, and arranges them around the room as if they were oversized, soft computer components. One pillow is the keyboard, another the monitor, another the mouse, and so forth. Sarah presses down on a corner of the keyboard pillow, and the child at the monitor pillow is expected to react in one or another way. All the participants at the session agreed that Sarah and her friends, all of whom had been using computers since infancy, represented the future, and it was good. Does this mark the end of childhood, as Neil Postman might have it? Consider the childhood of a privileged child nearly 400 years ago. A Dauphin of France, the future Louis XIII's childhood, according to Philippe Aries, was typical of the children of the aristocracy. Born in 1601, at 17 months, he played the violin, the same age at which he played a bowling game called mall. At 2, he is taught formal dancing. Before he is 3, he is taught how to play tennis. At 3 1/2, how to read. At 4, how to write. And at 5, how to play cards. He took part in musical and theatrical entertainments, mixing with adults in their games and celebrations from early childhood. At 7, according to Aries, he was engaged in activities almost imperceptible from those of adults: hunting, riding, fencing, and playgoing. Does this make him a poster child for David Elkin? A cover for the next edition of The Hurried Child? Is this work, or should we more accurately characterize it as play, or simply part of growing up? One has to wonder how readily, how naturally the child took to what were, all things considered, demands being placed upon him at a very early age. This may not have been work, as ordinarily construed, but isn't that what concerns us when we look at the Dauphin's contemporary counterparts, however talented, the Jennifer Ciprianis and the Tiger Woods? Of course, work as play and play as work does not end in childhood. For those of you who have read Our Hard Times in Paradise may recall, one of the biggest tasks in putting together our homestead was developing an adequate water source. After several years and several failures, we put together a system in which we collected water from a spring, pumped it up to the top of the ridge, and gravity fed it to the house, garden, and outbuildings. This required that each morning, except in winter, one of the boys would have to make his way down a twisting path into the canyon and start the pump. After a season of this, they decided that they could do the job more quickly and even enjoy it if they could bike down and back. And to do that, they would have to cut a trail diagonally down the steep face of the south ridge to the pump. And so they did, with pick and shovel and handsaws across the length of the 47 acres. For weeks, every afternoon, they disappear into the woods and return hours later to report how far they had gotten, what new problems they had encountered, a stump that they'd have to circumvent, a rocky outcropping that made it slow going. The result of this investment of a great amount of time and effort was a 2-foot wide thoroughfare through the woods that they would race down and back on their bikes, setting and breaking carefully recorded records, and not fortunately, their necks. Was this work? Was it play? Or was it sport? The bike trail certainly was not an important contribution to the overall well-being of the homestead. And they spent a lot more time making it than they ever would have spent climbing up and down the footpath. Might they have better spent their time practicing their hook shots or reading the poems of Emily Dickinson? Would we more readily recognize this as real work if we, their parents, insisted that this was something that had to be done, that it was part of the program, that it would be good for them, and they didn't want to do it? Aristotle would have had no problem with this. This was the domain of slaves and unworthy of further consideration. John Dewey would probably have approved of it, as would most progressive educators, insofar as it was possible to establish that at least some learning took place. But we would argue that it was simply activity, a quite literal shaping of the world, to use Freire's phrase, and to categorize this, or indeed most of the activities of childhood, as work, play, sport, useful, useless, worthwhile or not, is to obfuscate through analysis. So let us consider what we might call work as an ordeal. Some years ago, John Gatto and David discovered that they grew up only a few miles apart. Both of them are from small steelmaking towns in the Monongahela River Valley of western Pennsylvania. One of the many things they found themselves recalling about growing up in a steelworker culture was how difficult it was to find steady employment in the mills, even in the best of times. You had to know someone to get an entry-level job as a member of a labor gang, and you usually spent a long time shoveling slag or cleaning out cooling furnaces before you were moved up to a job that was not as dirty, dangerous, or physically exhausting. For those who remained in the mills, the work could be a lifelong ordeal. But for many of them, especially those whose parents had moved into white-collar jobs as teachers, accountants, and so forth, working in the mill as a teenager was a rite of passage. A friend of the family, a foreman or crane operator would vouch for you, and you'd get a summer job on the labor gang at 16. And you'd work in the mills through high school and often through college. The point of all this was that it was a very effective way of impressing upon a young man what indeed work was. The lesson one learned very quickly was that some people might have no choice but to spend their lives as mill workers. But if there was any way out, you'd go for it. and the effectiveness of making work an ordeal has its appeal as a motivator, encouraging, allowing our children to experience what we might call the downside of work can give them a perspective on the world that they might otherwise not develop. But when our boys were clearing brush, milling logs, and building houses, it was not as part of a program to test or toughen them, or indeed explicitly teach them anything. Our second son, Drew, who is a death row appeals attorney down in Alabama, was given the job of accompanying a middle-aged black man who had been released from the state prison on the trip across the state back to his home. Drew relates how uncomfortable he was for the first few minutes they were together. This white, northern, Harvard-educated lawyer and a man who had been framed by the local police and spent 4 years on death row. But after the ex-prisoner mentioned that he hoped he could revive his pulpwood logging business, and Drew, with a question or two, made it clear that he knew something about working in the woods, they found themselves comparing experiences, talking about equipment and the industry. Back in the 70s and 80s, when the boys were learning how to work in the woods, none of us could have ever imagined that one of them would be putting those experiences to use in the backwoods of the Deep South and making his work a little more meaningful. Some might suggest that by giving our children meaningful work experiences, we are helping to prepare them for the world of work as adults. When Grant, who has been recently appointed Director of AIDS Clinical Trials Research for the City of San Francisco, in addition to serving as an adjunct professor of medicine at the University of California Medical Center, went down to our local health clinic to volunteer his services in the early 80s, he did so with the intention of trying to get a sense of what it might be like to work in a medical setting. The health center had never had anyone volunteer to work in the lab or just help out with whatever came up. So Grant was given the responsibility, pretty much, for creating a job for himself. But when Reed and Drew went down to the local resort and found themselves responsible at $3 an hour for doing everything from restoring deteriorated cabins to grilling steaks, it was not because they were interested in learning how to manage a resort. If Grant had become a veterinarian, Reed or Drew, architects or contractors or civil engineers, or if Garth, who never showed much interest in cooking and is now studying to become a chef, had become a forest ranger or an environmental worker, then we might more readily agree that the work they did off the ranch in their teen years could be appropriately regarded as career preparation. The point, however, is that with the exception of Grant, who earlier on we thought was going to be an archaeologist, that they did not go into any of the fields that their experiences as teenage workers might have led us to predict. Certainly they acquired information and developed ways of looking at things as a result of their various jobs, but all experience, and not only work activities, provided that to some degree or another. Another way to consider the value of work is to look at it as a way of knowing. We do not train the eye and the hand, said Ralph Waldo Emerson a century and a half ago. We exercise their understanding to the apprehension and comparison of some facts, to a skill in numbers, in words. We aim to make accountants, attorneys, engineers, but not to make able, earnest, great-hearted people. Maria Montessori understood this very well, but unfortunately her ideas are generally regarded as having relevance only to the lives and education of the very young. Artists and craftsmen understand this. Knowing is a process of doing. thought and product become interwoven in the process of action, of work. This is yet another version of what analysts such as Jerome Bruner and Norman Goodwin call the constructivist tenet, which is to say, the view that reality is made, not found. In working on or with things, we achieve understanding. What meaning should we derive from this as non-schooling parents? It means, I think, like Shakers, we need to break down the division between the holy and the mundane spheres through manual labor. We need to provide our children with opportunities to engage in real work in the home and in the community, not in order to collect experiences the way one might collect stamps, but in order to construct their own worlds and to develop the kind of realities that will serve them throughout life. We mention in Homeschooling for Excellence the importance of providing young children, as soon as they are able to handle them, with real tools, rather than as sets of miniatures sold in toy stores. Similarly, we need to provide them with real work experiences, hefty, rough-edged, and potent, rather than the safely prepackaged courses, lessons, and programs that are represented as passports to greater understanding. But in talking about work in these terms, work as pastime, work as play, work as an ordeal, work as career preparation, work as a way of knowing, we should not overlook the world of work as defined and experienced by most people. Studs Terkel opens his best-selling collection of interviews conducted in the late 60s with the following quote: "This book, being about work, is by its very nature about violence to the spirit as well as to the body. It is about ulcers as well as accidents, about shouting matches as well as fistfights, about nervous breakdowns as well as kicking the dog around. It is above all about daily humiliations, a job. Most jobs are too small for our spirits. We would argue that as parents, unschoolers, or educators, our job is to foster that spirit and help prepare our children to shape their reality in such a way as to be able not only to live full lives in the world, but to work to change that world. We don't need lists or toolboxes or curricula or leaders. All we need is to keep ourselves open on all sides to every opportunity to create new and better versions of this world. Over the last 20 years, we have come a long way in changing our own and the public's understanding of how our nation's children are being manipulated and exploited in the name of education. We do not seek it, but have had thrust upon us a responsibility for expanding our small world in which we have achieved a freedom to learn, the freedom to be for ourselves and for our children. As parents, we all know the first 20 years are the hardest, so let's get on with it. Thank you.
Let me begin here this morning with something of an apology, because I'm one of those people who get annoyed when they hear high-sounding academic jargon being used to describe some rather ordinary phenomena. Ever since John F. Kennedy was said to have it, all kinds of people, from Ronald Reagan to Michael Jackson and Madonna, have been said to possess something called charisma, a term with a very specific, very narrow meaning in the work of Max Weber, a German social historian. Much the same way, we hear the words paradigm shift being tossed about by everybody, from computer manufacturers to corporate consultants to car makers. In ordinary terms, a paradigm is a framework, a scaffolding, if you will, upon which ideas, around which ideas are organized. Back in the early 60s, Professor Kuhn, a philosopher of science, came up with a term to describe what happens when a system of knowledge undergoes just a massive change, a massive shift, with the result that everything in that framework has to be perceived differently. That's a paradigm shift. It's a very complicated concept. As I say, we throw that term around casually. So I begin by apologizing. I'm going to use the word paradigm shift, but I don't want you to walk out of here thinking that I'm using the term paradigm shift in a very serious way. But let's just use it as a hook on which to carry, I think, three themes that I'd like to develop, three areas in which we have experienced or need to experience something of a paradigm shift. And I'll start with what we experienced in our family as something of a paradigm shift in the course of the educating of our boys. And we think here this is something we need to face up to and recognize as parents who are educating our kids in a very real world. When we look at what we did on the ranch over the years, we come up with a whole list of activities. We raised turkeys, we raised cattle, we raised rabbits, we raised sheep, and of course we raised goats. The old saying, you should plant a tree before you die. By that logic, I should live about 3,000 years. We cleared land, we brushed land. Grant created a goat business, we had a sheep business, we sold Boonville bacon to one of the better restaurants in San Francisco. It was on the menu as Boonville bacon. We raised turkeys and we made money by selling turkeys. We raised rabbits and we made money by selling rabbits. We sold firewood. Those of you who have seen or read Hard Times in Paradise, or heard us speak elsewhere, the irony of being in Berkeley selling firewood, family of 5 and 6, carrying in firewood up the steps, behind the stairs, and under the deck of a professor that thought he was dealing with people who had no better way to spend their lives, was the sort of thing that teaches, I think, a degree of toughness and a degree of ironic distance in a 12 or 13, 14, or 15-year-old. The point being here that we had engaged in this kind of work. We were unschoolers throughout this. We did not have the idea, you will have a rabbit project because this will teach you something. You will deliver firewood because it will make you tougher or stronger. It will develop character. These were simply things that came out of the situation in which we placed ourselves and found ourselves. I think it's a theme that we need to recognize. We had the luxury, and I think we all have the luxury in our different ways, had the luxury of creating our own reality. The old saying is that you can make your own way, but you cannot always make it your own way exactly as you would like to have it made. Prevailed in our setting. We found ourselves doing work that sometimes was not particularly satisfying or particularly gratifying, but at the same time we recognized that it was part of the organic whole of which we were a part. The problem, as we see it, when we talk about this, is parents will come up to us and say, then you were unschoolers. Well, yes, we were unschoolers. I guess we were de-schoolers, we were non-schoolers. But basically, we were simply living in a world with its demands its opportunities. We did not objectify, in part because we did not have this community that we have here now. This idea that we objectify and deify the kind of things we are doing. This community did not exist in 1973, 74, 72, 71, and on into the late 70s. So by not reifying this, we could say, yes, we are in fact unschoolers. The paradigm shift takes place, however, those of you who have gone through this will recognize it. The paradigm shift occurs when one moves from meeting one's own needs at a familial level, operating and functioning organically, when one changes, when one moves from that level to meeting the demands of a larger society. And what I'm talking about here, and we try to make this point, don't make it all that clearly, I'm afraid, in some situations. When the child becomes essentially his or her own person, the paradigm shift occurs because you move from learning and education in the nuclear sense, the nuclear family sense, where the nuclear family becomes the focus. And you move now to having to face the fact that we live in a society that does not place very much value. In fact, from all indicators, is doing all it possibly can to destroy the nuclear family, because after all, it's better if we're mobile, it's better if we can break relationships and move on to things. It's better if we can divide our time at the demands of corporate America rather than on the basis of what our family needs are. So we move into a kind of paradigm shift, at least we found ourselves doing this, and we did characterize it by those terms, and I don't want you to take it all that seriously here. But the shift takes place when you move to having to face up to the fact that you are moving into a credentializing world, a world in which you will function not according to your instincts, not according to your character, not according to the things that you or your family or your friends or the people you respect hold valuable, but you are moving into a world where outside authorities, those with the power to control or manipulate your life further on, can exert power. Now, it's possible to be a doctor, to learn to be a doctor. Some people said to us, well, why did your boys go up to Harvard, or why didn't you go up to Harvard Medical School, Yale Law School, whatever, when they could have done this at home? Couldn't they have done this at home? Well, of course they could. I guess you could get the books from the medical school. You go on to the local bookstore, the medical area of any particular university, buy the books, learn gross anatomy, learn surgery, and so forth. But I wouldn't recommend you try to practice it. You can learn the law. Now, there was a time when you could learn the law. And perhaps you can still here in Massachusetts. There are some places where you can teach yourself the law. You do not have to go to law school to go and to take the bar exam. So you can teach yourself law. You can perhaps, or you could until recently, go through this and become credentialized. But for the most part, what we find ourselves doing as we move into that larger world is meeting other standards, having to meet other requirements. And that's when we run up against a challenge to many of the assumptions we make as unschoolers, homeschoolers, family-centered learners, whatever. And we find ourselves having to accommodate ourselves to that reality. And the real question here, I think, is that if we do this, what are we doing to our view, our understanding of this world in which we have raised our children? Are we repudiating at the age of 14, 15, or 16, or 17? Now that our children move into the, quote, real world of real work, that demoralizing, humiliating world of work that Studs Terkel talks about, Are we really repudiating this? And I think one of the paradigm shifts that we have to address, one of the tasks we have ahead of us in the movement of which we are all a part, is to try to reconcile the world in which we have the freedom to be, the freedom to learn at an early age. But then is there a point at which we have to change all of those assumptions? I do not think we have been very successful on the whole in integrating what is a wonderful experience at the early and middle ages of our children. We have not very effectively integrated our educational views, our understanding of the world, with what is necessary to function credentialized in this world. And I think one of the assumptions here when we talk about unschooling, homeschooling, whatever, is that this is something that over the next 20 years it would be very nice to be able to have examples of people who have been able to go through this particular process and not ended up in marginal occupations or managed to carve out niches, because most of us, there simply aren't enough niches in society for all of our children to fill. But actually to create the kind of circumstances where we are successful. So that's one paradigm shift that I think we need to look at over the next 20 years. And it has to do with work, it has to do with how we prepare our kids. Do we really want to prepare our kids for that world of work that is out there? Think about it for a minute. That whole world of work, described by Scott Sterkel, the world of work you read about every day in the paper. Are we really preparing our kids for that world of work? Or are we prepared to try to transform that larger world in which they will work? And I think that is the hard task, that is the big task. And I think sometimes when homeschoolers are accused, or unschoolers are accused of being too concerned with their own children, I think part of the critique, or part of that criticism is, yeah, you may succeed in taking care of your kids, but look at that world they're going to have to enter ultimately. Ultimately, that world will get to your child. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's necessary. But I think we have not addressed it in a formal way. We have not addressed it in a frontal way that we need to be dealing with it. Second thing, second paradigm that I think we need to address is the question of how we prepare our kids for this world of work. One of the most unnerving responses we give to parents who come up and say they cannot get their kids to do anything, they cannot get their kids involved, their kids are not interested in anything. We hear this in conferences over and over again. One of the things that we come up to against is the idea that what you need to do, perhaps, what we all need to do, is create an identity within the homeschooling movement, such as it is, in which we have a confluence of work and thought, a Peace Corps, if you will, within the homeschooling movement. A Peace Corps where we develop an identity where kids can identify clearly and in a very effective way activities and jobs and things that they can do. A habitat for humanity, if you will, where kids actually have options. I think one of the things that we are going to need to look forward to in the future, going to need to take into account, is the fact that many kids, 12, 13, 14, 15 years of age, in some communities, really do not have the opportunity to actually do things that involve manual, physical labor. Perhaps some with some talent will do sculpting. Perhaps some will become painters. Perhaps some will become craftspeople. But many kids do not have that particular inclination and do not have that particular interest. And I think what it would be desirable, what would be worthy, would be for us as homeschoolers not nationally, not even necessarily at the regional level, whatever. But I think it would be good, and I think Grace Llewellyn has touched upon this in a very effective way. There are people out there thinking about this, but I think one of the things we really need to address is, could we actually create an awareness program, a work program, if you will, a work study program that gives kids an opportunity to actually engage this world to do real things. Because I'm very uncomfortable when I see that we are actually moving in something of the other direction, where we are getting children to have experiences. Micki mentions this, where you have Outward Bound, where you have music lessons, where you have all of these things. People coming up to conferences and telling us, all I do is drive my children from one event to another as a homeschooling parent. To which we want to scream, well, stop it. Stop it. Let your child walk that distance, or let your child define, or help your child define, that world in which you are not feeling obliged because you have all this time, where you feel obliged to provide all these experiences, otherwise they might miss out on something. And I think there's that dimension to this that needs to be dealt with. And the reason I mentioned something of a Habitat for Humanity model or a Peace Corps model, and I'm not entirely serious, but I think we really need... She says I am. All right, I am. I just don't want to get too carried away here. But I think we need to create, at least in our local communities, a sense where kids really do something, where kids build something. I work on a school board where we take kids who are defined very euphemistically as at risk. For the most part, these kids who are at risk have come from dysfunctional families of an order that's unbelievable in some cases. And we bring them in, and we have one teacher, counselor for every 5 of these kids. And these kids learn to say such things as, I have really developed self-esteem here now that I've been involved in this program. And they learn to say things like, Mr. Smith is a wonderful person because he has taught me that I can be all that I can be. Taking the ads right off the television. And I sit in these meetings and I sit in these sections because one of the reasons I stay on a county school board, which is not as much fun as I'm sure all of you can imagine it must be. One of the reasons I stay on this school board is because it gives me access to these kids and in a way gives me an opportunity to try to bring about some changes in the programs, bad as they are, that exist in this particular setting. But I find myself sitting there sometimes saying, just let the kids do what they want to do. Let go of this person. They need a gymnasium. They need a baseball field. They need a music room. So we said, well, if we can get funding for that, we will certainly get those things for you, says the administrator. Okay? And then the second administrator will be put in the job of checking somebody, and by the time we work our way down, I will decide that we really can't do any of those things. To which my response would be, and is, too many times, and they know it by now, my response is, let the kids build their own field. Let them build their own music room. Let them build their own gym. Oh, but that would be complicated. You know, the interesting thing about it is when you talk to these kids, these at-risk kids, for any length of time, and they understand that you're not just talking to them to manipulate or massage them. When you talk to these kids and say, we can deliver. I will deliver. If you need a music room, we will provide you with the material. Then the kids start talking. You know what they look like? You know what they sound like? They sound like homeschooled kids, which is really frightening in one level. On one level, it really is frightening because you realize for all of the stuff that we're doing, teaching our kids to do all this, who are articulate for the most part, amazingly articulate kids, self-actualizing, friendly, and so on, forthcoming, uncomplicated in many ways. We realize here that so are these at-risk kids, except they are in an institutional and family setting that prevents this. But if you provide the opportunity where we're not massaging them, they talk, and they can be just as expressive and just as articulate. as many of the people that we assume are somehow those with, quote, advantages. But the problem, of course, is we don't have a way in which we can allow 12-year-olds to really build a building the size of this room. Why not? Because the administrators, the people who run American education, cannot imagine a community of kids and teachers with a $10 million budget trying to build a building like this. It's not the problem of the kids, it's the problem, lack of imagination, of the adults and these kids who are managing them. And these are kids who are not cheap entities. These are kids for whom our tax dollars, we're spending $8,000, $10,000, $15,000 a year to provide them with those expert counselors that tell them, you are a worthy person, you have self-esteem. Okay? So what I think really in the homeschooling arena, not only for our own kids, but let's start with our own kids. Let's make sure that we have the kind of projects, let's support the kind of work that people are doing in different areas to provide kids with real experiences that are manual, intellectual, and socially significant. We have to move to this particular level, or otherwise we're going to find that, yes, we're terrific at raising our kids, but then our kids end up in mind-numbing jobs. Our kids grow up and are not prepared to confront the kind of realities that they do confront, and end up then not having the opportunities to raise their children, teach their children in the ways we have. Let me come to the third point. So the first point, the second point is we need to create some institutions that allow for real work and real opportunity. Now let me come to the third point. Then we'll have a few minutes here for questions. I'll be very brief here. I told Micki when we were preparing for this that I really wanted to do this. She said, don't be ridiculous. But I'll be ridiculous. It's part of my job. I said what we really need to do here is offer a reward, a prize, not a reward, but a prize, for the person or persons who come up with a term that describes what all of us are doing, that does not use two of the most polluted terms in our language, schools and education. Is there any way we can describe what we are doing without saying we are this or not that? Can we talk about what we are doing without saying we are homeschooled, we're backyard schoolers, we are something schoolers, we are good schoolers, we are great schoolers, we are terrific schoolers? Can we come up with this? So right now, Pat, where's Pat? Is he in here? Okay, Pat's going to offer $100. From all the profits of this particular conference. He's going to offer $100 for those of you who can come up with terms to describe. I'm not going to give any hints other than to say that natural schooling is one that we work with, and I don't think it would be a winner. But he's going to come up with a prize for those who can come up with a phrase to describe what we do in such a way that we don't just have to say what we don't do. And I think it's important because we are doing more, as Micki pointed out here, we are doing more than unschooling. We're certainly doing more than unschooling. We're certainly doing something grossly different from homeschooling. We are not home teachers. We do not do these things in the course of our daily life. So the realities that we are facing here have to be described differently. We need a linguistic paradigm shift. Growing without schooling, the next couple of issues will carry all of your submissions. Now, you just have to come in with a word, you understand. You have to come in with at least a paragraph explaining why that phrase or that term is a good one. And have the prize awarded next August.
Right. They'll be giving it your ranch.
The ceremony will take place on our mountaintop. With that, and I don't mean to be terribly ridiculous, but I really think here that unless we take it and pay serious attention to the world of work, we are really needing to pay attention to the fact that we are all engaged in a massive enterprise, a revolutionary enterprise, a radical enterprise, and in the same way, in many ways, a very conservative enterprise, which is to provide our kids and this society with a decent, dare I say, education, and to provide those kids with a world, ideally, with a world in which they can live. That's where we have not put our energies. We have not moved in the direction of changing that world in which our good kids are going to have to live. And we can turn out the most fantastic kids in the world, but if we give them a world in which they have to make compromises, have to be the mind-numbed, humiliated people that Studs Terkel talks about just to function in this world, then we have not done our job. And I leave you with that. We have time for about a few questions. We have a microphone up here, and if you have any questions, probably I would prefer you address them to Micki, because I don't want to have to justify anything I have said here.
We'll be glad to take any questions. We have a mic right here. If you just come up to the mic and come right up. We have to have you on a mic because of the taping.
It's a few years from now, and a new president calls you up, the president calls you up, and she wants to...
Yes, here!
And she wants to take over as secretary of HEW. What do you tell her?
Did everyone hear the question? No. In the next presidency, when the new president, calls us up and wants us to be the head of HEW, what do we tell her?
I think probably we would tell her to dissolve the agency, for starters. I think one of the things, your question is a really good one, because we've got this dilemma. On the one hand, there is so much to be done. On the other hand, we've got terrible people in positions that keep anything from being done. So I think, even though I don't agree that we just eliminate all aspects of whatever safety net society we have, I don't agree with that. On the other hand, just seeing the kinds of people who have evolved and ended up in these kinds of spots where they presumably have power, when I see the kind of reports that are coming out of the Department of Education, when we see all this, you realize that nothing is going to happen until we get people of quality, get people in these fields. And I think that's one of the goals that, or one of the things that has happened with our children. I think, in a way, they find themselves challenging these kinds of things. They will be working for the Department of Justice or against the Department of Justice, but working in institutional fields to try to change those fields. And I think our kids have got to, the kids of all of us, have got to move into those areas so we can say, well, what we need to do is hire your children. What we need to do is have so-and-so running HEW and so forth.
Hello. Is this on?
Yeah.
I don't have a question. What I have here is a suggestion. And I think that just in the way that many of us who have learned about homeschooling have learned a great deal from our children as they were home with us, in our homes, learning with us. And we had a chance to learn from their experiences, to learn how to think, to learn how to approach the world, to gradually peel off the layers and re-heal from what school has done to us. I think we should now look at what these kids are doing as they're going out into the world. And yes, some of them are doing as your sons have done, but there are an awful lot of homeschool kids who are going out and saying, no, we don't need those kinds of credentials. We're going to create our own work. We're going to find ways to fit in the cracks. We're going to find ways to spike the system, to be able to make meaningful contributions and find meaningful work. And the more I talk with parents who've grown up homeschoolers, the more amazed I am at the range of things that these young people are doing. And I think they're doing it. And what we should do is thank them and try to figure it out what it is that they're doing so that more people can do it.
I just have a quick input onto the question that you asked me. Well, I guess the challenge, as far as I'm concerned, the term that we should be doing is, or using is raising our children. We're just raising our children.
Based on what you just challenged us at the end, it's interesting. I have a letter on their desk about that with about 4 words. But and the way that you would say, you really didn't describe yourself. You kept saying unschoolers or homeschoolers, whatever I call myself. Do you therefore not have a particular style that you say is preferred? Because I feel that's a mistake, first of all. But to say, could we say unschooling? Is unschooling a style to you, or is it a philosophy? And so did your children all learn a similar style, or did they have very different styles, so therefore you don't really have a style?
Well, I think from listening to David and me, you know we don't like to categorize. And when we started raising our children, there was really not in our experience the word homeschooling. And it wasn't until the late 70s or early 80s that the term even became a part of our lives. So in that sense, we were never homeschoolers, deschoolers, or unschoolers. We were, I like that term, raising our children. And it was an organic whole process. And each child tailored his education to what he was interested in. And it was not a laying on, as I said in my remarks, it was not a laying on of information. It came from within each child.
Just the problem with it, I think, in a way, is that just the other day, right before we left, I got a telephone call from somebody who lived in California. She said, can you answer a few questions about homeschooling? I've been homeschooling my kids for 3 or 4 years and so forth. I said, what are the questions? She said, well, can you really keep them motivated? And I said, well, I don't know anything about it. I was wondering, well, where are we going on this? And besides, we've got to get these sheep taken care of and everything else before we leave. But her point was, or her comment was, that everybody around me, this is in Northern California, up over the Oregon border, she said, I'm really interested in homeschooling. She said, but everybody around me is an unschooler. I sort of thought, well, I think maybe you've called the wrong person, but I said, oh, well, I think really you've got to keep the kids motivated and so on and so forth, but why don't you read our books? And what bothered me about that was the connotation that somehow unschoolers were not doing the job. And that offends me. And I think that we should all be offended by that idea that we are somehow not up to the standards somehow or other of those of us that really make our kids jump through hoops and do things on a regular basis and are tough and mean because it's a tough, mean world. And I think we need to really look at that, and I think here the negative connotation of unschooling somehow as if we're not doing something would be useful. I'm not saying it's a crucial kind of issue, and I don't really want to beat a dead horse here too long, but the reality here is that could be translated into something, or could take into account all the things we, in fact, do. So our style is, yeah, that of unschoolers, but that does not mean we do not school. Okay?
I think we only have time for a couple more questions.
I get the question asked a lot about what we do. And basically, my idea as far as what we should call what we do is I just tell people we live life. That's basically all we do. And they don't understand that a lot of times. But we just do our day-to-day things and live life, and whatever happens, happens. So that's how I describe it.
Thank you for that. Pat's calling the shots here on time.
This is the last one, right? Yeah, last question.
I was just wondering if you had suggestions or examples of, you talked about finding work for children within the community, successes. Did they ever let them build the field or the building, or have you had smaller projects that have worked or ideas that we can go and implement at home?
Well, I think here, again, the projects that we had when we went down our list here over the last a month or so, the projects we had were primarily, the manual projects were on the ranch. The other projects off the ranch tended to be more providing the boys with experience with administrative systems, with organizations, with how to work with a boss, for example, for the first time, how to deal with these kinds of things. I think the examples here, in terms of the second point I was trying to make, was we really need to objectify some of these possibilities. It'd be really nice to say, well, there's a community center going up right out here, and kids here can, in this particular town, can work and help build that community center. Do real work. There's a wall that needs to be put up around some stream somewhere. They can actually do real stream restoration. These kinds of things are the kinds of things I think we really need to be working for and creating. I don't think they're out there. I think most people in this society, most adults, are very uncomfortable, at least initially. And I think John Gatto will tell you this. Most adults are uncomfortable with having kids come and take part in things. They're going to cut off a finger with a saw, they're going to be there after work, and who's going to take them home, so on and so on. So I think we really need to create these kinds of things a little more systematically, and really need to give a lot more thought to what can we do in individual communities. I certainly can't suggest from this perspective what should happen in your community, but I think we really need to do things as homeschoolers, unschoolers. It goes beyond being people who organize play days or park days.
Before we leave, and I'd just like to say that we'll spend some time over with our books, so if anyone has some questions, that's where we'll be for an hour or so. And then tomorrow we have a session, I think at 10:35, that's just simply questions and answers. So those of you who still have questions will still be here tomorrow. And before we adjourn, I would just like to thank Pat, Susan, and Day and Dawn Lees for organizing this 20th anniversary and celebration of John Holt's life. I think it's absolutely awesome that people came from such distances to attend this conference, and I think this is a chance in a lifetime to attend a conference that is so geographically diverse. So thank you very much, Pat.